In the Pacific theater of World War II, American troops were baffled by a peculiar phenomenon. Japanese prisoners of war, already traumatized by the shame of surrender, would become hysterical when faced with something seemingly trivial, a haircut. These soldiers, who had been willing to die rather than surrender, were now pleading desperately to keep their hair. The reason behind this intense reaction wasn't vanity, but something deeply embedded in Japanese military culture. For these men, their hair represented the last shred of their honor, and cutting it meant severing their final connection to their former lives and identities. This is the story of how a simple haircut became a profound cultural collision in the midst of humanity's deadliest conflict. The sun beat down mercilessly on Camp Livingston, Louisiana, June 1943, a place where the humid air clung to skin like a second uniform, and even breathing felt like drowning. Inside the hastily constructed barracks, dozens of Japanese prisoners sat in perfect rows on the floor, their postures rigid despite weeks in captivity. Outside, American guards mopped sweat from their brows, complaining about the heat, about the assignment, about anything to pass the time. Sergeant Frank Miller watched them through narrowed eyes. Japanese prisoners, the enemy, men who had been shooting at his friends just weeks ago. Men who had fought with such ferocity on Guadalcanal that stories of their refusal to surrender had spread through American ranks like wildfire. Yet here they were, captured, alive. Something didn't add up. Miller had expected defiance, had prepared for resistance. Instead, most prisoners maintained an eerie silence, eyes downcast, as if looking at nothing would make them invisible, as if they weren't really there. The order came down that morning. Standard procedure, process all new arrivals, medical examinations, delousing, haircuts, scissors, clippers, simple tools. Nothing threatening about them. Private Thomas Cooper, 22, fresh-faced with round glasses that made him look even younger, moved between groups of prisoners, clipboard in hand. His job was simple: explain the procedures, ensure compliance. The military had recognized his skill with languages, his year studying in Tokyo before the war. Now he served as interpreter, a bridge between worlds that seemed impossibly far apart. The announcement was made in English first. Then Cooper translated into Japanese, his accent careful but clear. All prisoners will receive medical examinations and haircuts for hygiene purposes. A ripple, subtle at first, a collective intake of breath, then murmurs, heads turning, eyes widening. Cooper noticed it immediately. Something in his words had struck a nerve, something unexpected. Please form an orderly line, he continued, following protocol. The process will be quick. The first group rose to their feet, but there was hesitation in their movements, a heaviness, something coiled and dangerous beneath their obedient exterior. An older man, a lieutenant by his former rank, approached the front of the line. His face remained impassive, but his hands trembled slightly. A guard motioned him to the chair. Scissors approached. Cold metal flashed in the light. The lieutenant's body went rigid. Then, without warning, he threw himself backward, collapsing to the floor. Words burst from him in rapid Japanese, his composure shattered into fragments. "No, I cannot. I will die first. Kill me instead." Guards converged instantly, weapons raised. Chaos erupted. Other prisoners began shouting, some moving forward as if to intervene, others backing away in terror. The room transformed from ordered silence to frantic energy in seconds. Miller's hand moved to his holster. "What the hell is going on?" he barked at Cooper. The young interpreter stood frozen, his mind racing to translate not just words, but the raw emotion behind them. The lieutenant was now on his knees, hands clasped as if in prayer, tears streaming down his face. His pleas had become desperate whispers. "He's begging," Cooper said, disbelief coloring his voice. "He's begging not to cut his hair." Scissors on the floor, guards surrounding the prisoner, tension thick enough to choke on. Miller scoffed. His hair? All this over a damn haircut? Around the room, other Japanese prisoners began touching their own hair with subtle, almost reverent movements. Fingers running through dark strands, palms pressing against the back of their heads. Small, private gestures that seemed to carry enormous weight. Cooper noticed. No one else did. The lieutenant was restrained, removed from the processing area. The remaining prisoners watched him go, their faces masks of controlled fear. When the next man was called forward, he stepped up with mechanical precision, but Cooper saw the slight tremble of his jaw, the way his eyes darted toward the door, as if calculating escape. "Proceed," Miller ordered, but Cooper raised a hand. "Sir, I think there's something important happening here." Miller's patience was wearing thin. "What's important is getting these men processed according to regulations, Private. But sir, their reaction, it's not what you'd expect. These are the same soldiers who charged into machine gun fire on Guadalcanal. The same men who chose death over capture, who threw themselves on grenades. And now they're breaking down over haircuts? Doesn't that strike you as strange?" The processing continued, but with each prisoner, the pattern repeated. Some submitted silently, their bodies rigid with barely contained emotion. Others pleaded, desperate bargaining in broken English and rapid Japanese. One young soldier, barely older than Cooper himself, wept openly as the first locks of his black hair fell to the floor. By midday, the situation had deteriorated. 3 prisoners had to be physically restrained. One had attempted to grab a pair of scissors, turning them not toward the Americans, but toward his own throat. In the camp commander's office, Miller reported the strange events. Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, eyes skeptical. "You're telling me we've got an entire barracks in uproar over haircuts? These are the same fanatics who fight to the death?" Cooper stood slightly behind Miller, listening. His mind worked through cultural references, fragments of knowledge from his studies, conversations with Japanese friends, in what now seemed like another lifetime. "Sir," he said, stepping forward. "Permission to speak?" Harrison nodded curtly. "I've been watching them, the Japanese prisoners. There's something ritualistic about the way they touch their hair, almost sacred. I think this might be about more than hygiene to them." Miller rolled his eyes. "It's hair, Cooper. It grows back." "Maybe to us," Cooper said softly. "But what if it represents something else to them? What if cutting it means something we don't understand?" The colonel considered this, fingers drumming against his desk. "You've got 1 hour, Cooper. Figure it out. Because I've got standing orders, and those haircuts are happening with or without your cultural insights." As Cooper left the office, the question crystallized in his mind, taking shape with new urgency. What power could a simple haircut hold to break men who had been trained never to surrender? What invisible force turned the mere touch of scissors into a fate seemingly worse than death itself? The cherry blossoms fell like snow across Japan in the spring of 1937. In training grounds throughout the empire, young men stood at attention, their freshly shaved heads gleaming in the morning sun. All except for the officer cadets, who wore their hair with meticulous precision, each strand a testament to their status, their family legacy, their very identity. Among them stood Takeshi Yamamoto, 19 years old, his back straight as the ancestral sword his grandfather had passed down through generations. The sword now resided in a place of honor at home, but its spirit lived within him. The weight of family expectation rested on his shoulders as surely as the rising sun emblem on his uniform. He had been chosen, like thousands of others, to become part of something greater than himself, to dissolve his individual desires into the collective will of the empire. For the Japanese soldier, surrender was not merely defeat. It was the dissolution of self, a spiritual death that left only a hollow shell where a warrior once stood. This truth was instilled in every aspect of their training, woven into daily rituals with the same precision as the sacred cords that bound their ceremonial armor. While American soldiers trained to win battles and return home, Japanese soldiers prepared for glorious death or magnificent victory. There was no middle ground, no honorable compromise, no acceptable surrender. In training halls across Japan, young recruits sat cross-legged on wooden floors, eyes closed in meditation as instructors paced between them, reciting the principles of Bushido. The warrior code flowed through centuries of Japanese history like an unbroken river, carrying the essence of what it meant to be samurai, to be Japanese, to be a man of honor. Courage, loyalty, honor, respect, honesty, rectitude. These virtues formed the backbone of military indoctrination, reinforced through endless drills, through stories of ancestral glory, through the constant reminder that they were descendants of gods. Their training was not merely physical, but spiritual, psychological, complete. The mind was molded with the same intensity as the body. A warrior who surrenders brings shame not only upon himself, but upon 8 generations of ancestors, their instructors would say, voices resonant in the stillness of the training hall, and upon 8 generations yet to come. The concept penetrated deeper than conscious thought. It became instinct, reflex, as natural as breathing. Death before dishonor was not a slogan, but a fundamental truth, as undeniable as gravity. Surrender meant that you rejected your ancestors, your emperor, your very identity as a Japanese man. This worldview stood in stark contrast to Western military tradition. For American soldiers, surrender when faced with impossible odds was regrettable, but pragmatic. Live to fight another day. There was no spiritual annihilation in laying down arms when defeat was inevitable, only the practical recognition of reality. Survival meant returning to loved ones, to hometowns, to futures still bright with possibility. American soldiers wrote letters home filled with longing for their return. Japanese soldiers prepared death poems. In Takeshi's barracks, evenings were spent in quiet ritual. While some polished boots or weapons, others attended to their hair with the same reverence. For officer cadets especially, hair was not merely an aesthetic concern, but a connection to history itself, a physical manifestation of the unbroken lineage that defined them. Takeshi ran a wooden comb through his hair each night, 100 strokes exactly. The methodical motion calmed his mind, centered his thoughts. His father had done the same before him, and his grandfather before that. Warriors throughout Japanese history had treated their hair with similar reverence. The top knot of the samurai was not merely a style, but a statement of identity, of status, of spiritual connection to ancestors who had fought and died with honor. Your hair carries the spirit of your forefathers, his grandfather had told him on the day he left for military service. The old man's hands had trembled slightly as they smoothed Takeshi's collar. When you feel the wind move through it in battle, know that they stand with you. In Japanese cultural tradition, hair held mystical significance far beyond Western understanding. Throughout history, Buddhist monks had shaved their heads to renounce worldly attachment, while samurai cultivated their hair as a symbol of their warrior status. Hair was believed to be connected to the soul, a physical extension of spiritual essence. To cut it was not merely a change in appearance, but a transformation of identity, a ritual as significant as death and rebirth. For military officers especially, hair represented the continuation of warrior tradition. Many could trace their lineage back to samurai families, could recite the names of ancestors who had served daimyo lords centuries before. The physical connection to those ancestors, tenuous as it might seem to outsiders, was embodied in the careful maintenance of their appearance, in upholding the visual tradition of the warrior class. During their training, historical education reinforced these connections. Young officers studied not only modern tactics, but ancient battle strategies, not only current weapons, but the artistry of traditional sword-making. They were not creating a new military identity, but inhabiting an ancient one, becoming living links in a chain that stretched back to the legendary founders of Japan itself. The psychological conditioning was total and encompassing. Daily pledges of loyalty to the emperor, ritual purification ceremonies, recitation of imperial rescripts until they could be spoken in perfect unison, without hesitation or error. Discipline was enforced through physical punishment, through public humiliation, through the constant pressure of collective responsibility. One man's failure reflected on all. One man's dishonor contaminated his entire unit. As war clouds gathered across the Pacific, the training intensified. The enemy was dehumanized through propaganda, through carefully constructed narratives of racial superiority, through constant reminders that the imperial destiny of Japan was to lead Asia into a new era, free from Western corruption. American soldiers were portrayed as spiritually weak, technically advanced, but lacking the warrior spirit that made Japanese fighters invincible. They will break, instructors promised. They fight for money, for land, for abstract ideals. We fight for the emperor, for our ancestors, for our very souls. They cannot match such dedication. In this atmosphere of absolute certainty, the concept of surrender became increasingly unthinkable. Stories circulated of soldiers who chose ritual suicide over capture during the China campaigns, their names honored in hometown shrines, their families receiving white feathers, signifying the purity of their sacrifice. Meanwhile, the rare men who were captured and later returned faced ostracism, their families sometimes refusing to acknowledge them, their former identities effectively erased. Takeshi absorbed these lessons along with his comrades, his worldview shaped by forces he could hardly recognize, let alone question. The collective beliefs became personal conviction, national mythology transformed into individual identity. By the time he received his officer's sword in graduation ceremonies, the psychological transformation was complete. He was no longer simply Takeshi Yamamoto, son of a provincial family. He was an extension of imperial will, a vessel for ancestral honor, a living embodiment of Bushido. As war erupted across the Pacific, thousands of men like Takeshi carried these beliefs into battle, each one convinced of the righteousness of their cause, each one prepared to die rather than face the spiritual obliteration of surrender. Their weapons were modern, their aircraft and ships technically advanced, but their psychological foundation rested on concepts centuries old, on ideas about honor and identity that would prove impervious to practical concerns like survival. They carried hidden within their military packs small personal shrines, family talismans, locks of hair from mothers or wives sewn into protective amulets. These physical connections to home reinforced the spiritual bonds they fought to uphold. Many tied ceremonial headbands before combat, white fabric emblazoned with rising suns or traditional sayings, another connection to warrior traditions extending back through generations. The collision course was set long before the first shots were fired at Pearl Harbor. Two military forces would meet across Pacific Islands and ocean battles. But the deeper conflict was between incompatible worldviews, between fundamentally different understandings of what it meant to be a soldier, to be honorable, to be human. Americans would go to war expecting the universal logic of surrender when defeat was certain. They prepared POW camps with the assumption that enemy soldiers, like their own, would ultimately choose life over pointless death. They could not conceive of an adversary who viewed capture as worse than annihilation, who carried within them a cultural imperative that made surrender not merely dishonorable, but spiritually impossible. And so, as Japanese forces swept through the Pacific in the early months of war, as island garrisons fell and Allied forces retreated, the stage was set for a confrontation not just of military might, but of irreconcilable cultural values. The Japanese soldiers carried with them not just weapons and tactical training, but an entire cosmology, a set of beliefs about existence itself that would prove as dangerous as any bullet or blade, both to their enemies and ultimately to themselves. What waited across the endless blue horizon was not simply an enemy force, but a fundamental challenge to everything they believed. And when the tide of war inevitably turned, when Japanese soldiers found themselves facing the previously unthinkable prospect of defeat and capture, the psychological fortress built through years of indoctrination would be tested in ways no training had prepared them for. The warriors who had been taught that surrender meant spiritual death would discover new kinds of suffering, new dimensions of loss in the prison camps of their enemies. And it would begin with the simple, inexplicable horror of a pair of scissors approaching their hair. The wooden benches of Camp Livingston creaked under the weight of men who had once commanded battalions, piloted fighter planes, navigated destroyers through storm-tossed seas. Now they sat in identical uniforms, their faces blank masks, their hands resting on knees that no longer bent in formal rituals of respect. The Louisiana summer pressed against the windows like a living thing, hot and insistent. Sweat trickled down spines, pooled in the hollow spaces between collar and neck. The air smelled of disinfectant, of unwashed bodies, of fear. Lieutenant Hideki Tanaka stared at his hands, hands that had once gripped a ceremonial sword with perfect precision, hands that had accepted his officer's commission with pride, hands that had raised the flag of the rising sun over conquered territory. Now they lay useless in his lap, the nails bitten to the quick, the palms scratched raw in moments of private anguish, captured, dishonored, dead to his family, dead to himself. He had tried 3 times already, once with a belt torn into strips, once by smashing his head against the concrete floor until guards restrained him, once by refusing food until his body betrayed him by continuing to live despite his will to die. His grandfather's voice haunted his dreams. Better to be a corpse in the ocean than a prisoner in enemy hands. But here he sat, still breathing, still existing in this shadow realm between life and death. Across the barracks, Captain Yoshida methodically folded and refolded his thin blanket, the movements precise, controlled, a remnant of military discipline applied to meaningless tasks. His eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had witnessed his entire unit fall in a battle that military historians would later describe as hopeless from the outset. He had not been captured because he surrendered. He had been found unconscious, half buried in jungle soil, a concussion having robbed him of the choice between honorable death and shameful survival. When he woke in an American field hospital, the reality of his situation had struck with the force of physical pain. His first words had been a request for a weapon, any weapon, so that he might correct the error of his continued existence. The American doctors had not understood. They had congratulated him on his survival, had spoken of his luck as if living were somehow preferable to an honorable death. In the far corner, Sergeant Kenji Nakamura huddled against the wall, knees drawn to his chest. 23 years old. former university student. Poet, the youngest son of a family that had sent generations of men to serve the emperor. His capture had come after days without food or water, his unit surrounded, ammunition exhausted. American loudspeakers had promised humane treatment. In his delirium, in his weakness, he had taken a step forward instead of saving his last bullet for himself. That single step replayed in his mind, constantly, a moment of failure that defined his existence now more completely than all his previous achievements combined. Each man carried similar burdens, similar regrets, similar shame. They moved through the routines of the camp like ghosts, present but not present, alive but not living. The Americans provided food, medical care, even occasional recreation, unable to comprehend that these offerings meant nothing to men who had already died in every way that mattered to them. Morning roll call, breakfast, work details, lunch, more work, dinner, lights out. Days blending into one another with monotonous regularity. Until today. Outside the processing building, Private Cooper paced nervously. After his conversation with Colonel Harrison, he had spent hours in the camp library, searching through limited resources for any information about Japanese cultural attitudes toward hair. The results had been frustratingly vague, references to samurai traditions, mentions of Shinto beliefs about spiritual energy residing in hair. Nothing concrete enough to explain the visceral reactions he had witnessed. Inside, Sergeant Miller supervised the setup with brisk efficiency. 3 stations, medical examinations first, delousing powders second, haircuts third, standard procedure for processing prisoners in American custody. Hygienic, practical, routine. Make it quick, Miller instructed the barbers, 2 privates with minimal training who normally cut their fellow soldiers' hair. Nothing fancy, just get it short enough to prevent lice. Electric clippers were plugged in, their cords snaking across the wooden floor. Scissors laid out on small tables, combs soaking in disinfectant. The metallic snip of shears being tested filled the air as the barbers prepared their stations. The first group of prisoners entered, escorted by guards, whose hands rested casually on holstered sidearms. After the earlier incident, security had been increased. No chances would be taken with these unpredictable prisoners, who somehow found standard processing procedures more traumatic than combat itself. Lieutenant Tanaka led the group, his steps mechanical. Behind him came Captain Yoshida, then Sergeant Nakamura, followed by 7 other prisoners arranged by former rank. Military hierarchy preserved even in captivity, even in shame. The medical examinations proceeded without incident. Blood pressure, temperature. Brief check for infectious diseases or injuries requiring treatment. The prisoners submitted silently, their faces impassive, their eyes fixed on some distant point. The delousing station created more tension. The American privates applying powder to hair and clothing worked quickly, but their casual touch, their proximity, triggered visible discomfort in the Japanese officers. Bodies stiffened, jaws clenched. Captain Yoshida's hands curled into fists at his sides, knuckles white, with restraint. Cooper watched from near the door, noting every reaction, searching for patterns, for clues. Then the first prisoner reached the barber station. "Sit down, please," the barber said, gesturing to the chair. Cooper translated, his voice carefully neutral. Lieutenant Tanaka stared at the chair as if it were an instrument of torture. His breathing quickened visibly. A fine tremor began in his hands, spread to his shoulders. "Sir, please sit," Cooper repeated, then added in Japanese, "It is required." The lieutenant's eyes darted to the scissors, to the electric clippers, back to Cooper's face. Something broke in his expression. The careful mask of indifference cracked, revealed raw desperation beneath. "I cannot. he whispered in Japanese. "Please, anything else, any punishment. But not this." Sergeant Miller stepped forward, impatience evident in his stance. "What's the holdup, Cooper?" "He's reluctant, sir." "Reluctant? He's getting a haircut, not a tooth pulled. Tell him to sit down or we'll make him sit down." Cooper translated the warning, hating the words even as he spoke them. The lieutenant's face drained of color. For a moment, Cooper thought he might collapse. Instead, with visible effort, he straightened his shoulders and sat in the chair, his body rigid with tension. The barber draped a cloth around his shoulders. The sound of electric clippers buzzed to life, harsh and mechanical in the quiet room. And then it began. The first lock of black hair fell to the floor. Lieutenant Tanaka watched it fall with an expression of such profound grief that Cooper felt his chest tighten in response. The second lock followed. The third. With each pass of the clippers, the lieutenant's breathing grew more ragged. His shoulders began to shake. Tears welled in eyes that had remained dry through medical examinations, interrogations, the daily humiliations of captivity. Behind him, the other prisoners watched with increasing agitation. Captain Yoshida's face contorted with suppressed emotion. Sergeant Nakamura began to rock slightly, forward and back, his lips moving in what appeared to be silent prayer. The barber, focused on his task, noticed nothing unusual. To him, it was a routine haircut, no different from hundreds he had given fellow soldiers. The guards, however, sensed the building tension. Hands moved closer to weapons. Bodies shifted into more defensive postures. Hair continued to fall, black against white floor. The lieutenant's shoulders now shook with silent sobs. Tears streamed down his face, falling to mingle with the hair below. The barber paused, uncomfortable with this unexpected display of emotion. "Keep going," Miller ordered. "Let's get this over with." The clippers resumed their work. Around the room, other prisoners began to exhibit signs of extreme distress. Some turned away, unable to watch. Others seemed frozen in horror. Sergeant Nakamura dropped to his knees, bent forward until his forehead touched the floor, an ancient posture of abject submission or desperate prayer. The buzzing stopped. The lieutenant sat transformed. His hair, once carefully maintained in the traditional style of a Japanese officer, now lay in clumps around the chair. His bare scalp gleamed under the harsh lights. He raised a trembling hand to touch the back of his head, fingers searching for what was no longer there. A sound escaped him, something between a moan and a whimper, primal in its raw anguish. Miller frowned, bewildered by the extreme reaction. "Next," he called, gesturing to Captain Yoshida. The captain did not move. His eyes were fixed on Lieutenant Tanaka, on the shorn head, on the hair scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. Something changed in his expression, a shift from rigid control to something wilder, more dangerous. "Next," Miller repeated, voice sharp with authority. Captain Yoshida lunged suddenly, not toward the Americans, but toward the table of barber tools. His hand closed around a pair of scissors before the guards could react. Cooper shouted a warning, but it came too late. The captain raised the scissors, not toward any American, but toward his own throat. 3 guards tackled him to the ground. The scissors clattered across the floor. Chaos erupted as other prisoners began shouting, some moving forward as if to intervene, others backing away in terror. Guards shouted orders, weapons were drawn, threats made in 2 languages that neither side fully understood. Through the chaos, Cooper stood transfixed, watching Lieutenant Tanaka. The officer had not moved from the barber chair. He sat perfectly still now, tears still flowing, but his expression had changed. The grief remained, but something else had replaced the desperation. A terrible emptiness, as if something essential had departed, leaving only a hollow shell behind. And in that moment, watching the proud military officer transformed into something diminished, something broken, Cooper understood. The realization hit him with physical force, making him stagger slightly where he stood. It wasn't just hair they were cutting. It was identity. Honor. The final thread connecting these men to everything they had been before captivity. The last physical manifestation of their former selves, of their connection to ancestors, to tradition, to the warrior code that had defined their existence. For men who had already lost everything else, who lived in the shadow of perceived failure, who considered themselves spiritually dead, yet cursed to keep breathing, their hair remained the final vestige of who they had been, the last thing that was truly theirs, the only part of their identity the Americans had not yet taken from them, and they had just cut it away, casually, routinely, without understanding what they were really doing. "Stop!" Cooper said, his voice barely audible at first, then louder. "Stop! Everyone stop right now!" The room gradually quieted, all eyes turning to the young interpreter. "Sir," he said, addressing Miller directly, his voice shaking with the weight of his realization. "We need to stop the haircuts. Immediately." Miller stared at him in disbelief. "Because they're throwing tantrums? That's not how this works, Private." "No, sir," Cooper replied, struggling to find words adequate to convey what he now understood. "Because we're not just cutting their hair, we're cutting away the last piece of themselves they have left." Cooper stood in Colonel Harrison's office, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Through the window, he could see the processing building, where guards now stood outside closed doors. Inside, Captain Yoshida remained under special watch after his suicide attempt. Lieutenant Tanaka had been escorted back to the barracks, his steps unsteady, his newly shorn head bowed in a posture of complete defeat. The incident had been contained, but its ripples spread throughout the camp, invisible currents of fear and desperation flowing between barracks. "Explain it again," Harrison said, leaning forward across his desk, "and make me understand why I shouldn't just order the rest of these haircuts completed under armed guard." Cooper took a deep breath. The words felt inadequate, clumsy tools to convey what he had witnessed, what he now understood, with a clarity that made his chest ache. "Sir, when we cut their hair, we're not just following protocol. We're severing the last connection these men have to their identities as Japanese soldiers, as honorable men, as members of their families." Harrison's expression remained skeptical. Cooper searched for a way to bridge the vast cultural divide, to make the colonel see what he had seen in Lieutenant Tanaka's eyes. "To us, it's hygiene. To them, it's identity. To us, their resistance seems irrational. To them, compliance means final surrender." The colonel rubbed his temples. "Cooper, we've got procedures for a reason. Disease control in these camps is serious business. One outbreak of typhus, and we could lose hundreds, American guards included. I understand that, sir. But there are other ways to address hygiene concerns. What I'm trying to explain is that hair in Japanese culture, especially for military officers, carries profound significance." Cooper moved to the small bookshelf in the corner of the office, pulled down a volume on Japanese history he had found in his earlier research. He opened to a page showing traditional samurai with their distinctive hairstyles. For centuries, the way a warrior wore his hair was a mark of his status, his clan affiliation, his very identity as a man of honor. Modern Japanese officers see themselves as direct spiritual descendants of these samurai. Their hair connects them to that lineage, to centuries of warrior tradition. Harrison glanced at the illustration, his expression softening slightly with genuine curiosity. "Go on." "In Japanese belief, hair contains spiritual energy. Cutting it isn't just a physical change, but a spiritual transformation. Buddhist monks shave their heads to symbolize renouncing worldly attachments. For these officers, forced haircuts represent the final stripping away of their warrior identity. Cooper set the book down, searching for words that could convey the profound grief he had witnessed. Sir, we need to remember who these men were before capture. Elite officers, products of intense training and indoctrination. Men who were prepared to die for their emperor rather than surrender. Men who now view themselves as having failed in the most fundamental duty of a Japanese soldier. The colonel's eyes narrowed. They're prisoners of war, Cooper. That happens in combat. Not in their worldview, sir. In Japanese military culture, there is no honorable surrender. These men consider themselves already dead in every way that matters. Dead to their families, dead to their country. Their hair remains the last physical connection to who they were before this spiritual death. Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying the young interpreter. You've put a lot of thought into this. I had to understand what I was seeing, sir. The level of despair, the suicide attempts. It didn't make sense otherwise. Cooper moved to the window, looked out at the camp where hundreds of Japanese prisoners moved through their daily routines like automatons, present in body only. In those dark strands lay not just hair, but the final threads connecting them to everything they had ever been. When we cut their hair, we cut those threads. We don't just change their appearance, we transform them in their own eyes from fallen warriors who might someday restore their honor into non-entities, men with no past and no future. The colonel was silent for a long moment, considering. It's quite poetic, Private. But we're running a POW camp, not a philosophy seminar. With respect, sir, we're dealing with human beings shaped by a culture fundamentally different from our own. If we want to maintain order in this camp, we need to understand what drives these men, what they fear, what gives them hope. Harrison stood, paced to the window to stand beside Cooper. Together they watched as a group of prisoners returned from a work detail, their movements mechanical, their faces expressionless. Look at them, sir, Cooper said softly. They're already broken in ways we can barely comprehend. The shame of surrender has destroyed something essential in them. Their hair remains their last possession, the last thing that is truly theirs. The colonel's expression remained unreadable, but he nodded slightly, encouraging Cooper to continue. I spoke with several prisoners after the incident. One explained that his top-knot style was identical to what his grandfather wore as an imperial guard. Another showed me a small charm his mother had made containing a lock of her hair, meant to protect him in battle. These aren't just aesthetic preferences, sir. They're connections to family, to ancestors, to identity itself. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sergeant Miller entered, his face tight with contained anger. Sir, we've got another situation. Block C prisoners are refusing to eat. Word spread about the haircuts, and they're saying they'd rather starve than submit. Harrison cursed under his breath. How many? 43, sir, including 3 officers who were decorated for bravery at Shanghai. The colonel returned to his desk, sat heavily in his chair. This is becoming a larger problem than I anticipated. Cooper saw his opening. Sir, may I make a suggestion? One that satisfies our hygiene requirements, while respecting their cultural beliefs. Harrison gestured for him to continue. Instead of forced haircuts, we implement a voluntary delousing program. Regular applications of medicated shampoo, frequent inspections, quarantine for any prisoner showing signs of infestation. Those who maintain cleanliness standards keep their hair. Those who don't are given a choice between treatment or cutting. Miller scoffed. You want to negotiate with prisoners about camp regulations? I want to prevent more suicide attempts, Cooper replied evenly. I want to maintain order without creating unnecessary conflict. The colonel studied both men, weighing practical concerns against Cooper's cultural insights. The camp had been established to house prisoners for the duration of the war. Months, possibly years of containment lay ahead. Short-term compliance enforced through violence might create long-term management problems. There's more to consider, Cooper added. These men may eventually provide valuable intelligence. They'll be more cooperative if treated with cultural sensitivity. Harrison drummed his fingers on the desk, thinking. Miller, what's your assessment? Can we maintain hygiene standards without universal haircuts? Miller frowned. It creates additional work, sir. More inspections, more individualized treatment. But it's possible. And the security implications? Manageable, as long as we make it clear this is a privilege that can be revoked for non-compliance or disciplinary issues. The colonel nodded slowly. Cooper, I want you to draft a detailed proposal. Hygiene protocols, inspection schedules, clear conditions under which exceptions would be revoked. On my desk by 0800 tomorrow. Yes, sir. And I want you to select a Japanese officer, someone with authority among the prisoners, to help communicate these new protocols. Make it clear this is not a capitulation, but a practical accommodation that requires their cooperation. Cooper felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Lieutenant Tanaka would be a good choice, sir. Before his capture, he commanded significant respect. The one who had the breakdown during processing. Are you sure he's stable enough? I believe giving him this responsibility might help restore some sense of purpose, sir. Some small measure of dignity. Harrison considered this, then nodded. Arrange it. But Cooper, I'm holding you personally responsible for making this work. One disease outbreak, one major security incident, and we revert to standard protocols. Understood? Completely, sir. As Cooper left the office, Miller fell into step beside him, his expression troubled. You're taking a big risk, Private. These men aren't like us. They don't think like us. Cooper paused in the corridor, choosing his words carefully. That's precisely the point, Sergeant. They don't think like us, and we've been making decisions as if they do. It's still hard to swallow, all this drama over hair. Cooper shook his head. It's not about hair. Not really. It's about what remains when everything else is taken away. What would you cling to, Sergeant, if you lost everything that defined you? Your uniform, your rank, your freedom, your future? Miller had no immediate answer. For these men, hair isn't just something that grows on their heads. It's the last remnant of who they were, the last thing they control in lives that have become completely controlled by others. The sergeant's expression softened slightly. I still think you're overcomplicating things, Cooper. But I hope you're right about this approach working. So do I, Cooper replied quietly. Later that afternoon, Cooper sat across from Lieutenant Tanaka in a small interview room. The officer's demeanor had changed dramatically since the morning. His posture remained military straight, but something vital had dimmed in his eyes. The proud bearing that had survived weeks of captivity seemed finally broken by the loss of his hair. Cooper spoke gently in Japanese, explaining Colonel Harrison's decision, the new protocols being developed, the role Tanaka was being asked to play. At first, the lieutenant showed no reaction, as if the words weren't penetrating his consciousness. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, his expression changed. A slight widening of the eyes, a subtle shift in posture. The colonel is willing to allow us to keep our hair? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Under specific conditions, yes. Regular inspections, strict hygiene standards. Tanaka raised a hand to his shorn head, fingers tracing the unfamiliar contours. For me, it is too late. Hair grows back, Lieutenant, Cooper said gently. And in the meantime, you can help prevent others from experiencing what you did this morning. Something flickered in the officer's eyes. Not hope, exactly, but perhaps its distant cousin. Purpose, responsibility, a task that honored what remained of his military identity. "Why would your colonel make this accommodation?" Tanaka asked, suspicion edging into his voice. "What does he gain?" Cooper considered his answer carefully. He gains a camp where prisoners aren't driven to suicide over haircuts, where cooperation replaces resistance, where cultural understanding creates stability. The lieutenant studied Cooper's face, searching for deception, finding none. "And you? Why do you care about Japanese customs?" "Because I believe that even in war, perhaps especially in war, we need to recognize each other's humanity. Your traditions may be different from ours, but they deserve respect." Tanaka was silent for a long moment. Then he straightened, assuming the formal posture of an officer receiving orders. "I will assist in communicating these new protocols. I will ensure cooperation from my fellow officers." "Thank you, Lieutenant." As Cooper rose to leave, Tanaka spoke again, his voice quieter but steady. "Private Cooper, do you understand what happened this morning? Truly understand?" Cooper paused at the door. "I believe I'm beginning to. When a samurai was defeated in battle, if he survived, he would cut his top knot as a symbol of his disgrace. But this was a voluntary act, a personal acknowledgement of failure. To have it done by enemy hands." He did not complete the thought, but Cooper understood the profound difference. Self-chosen acknowledgement of defeat versus humiliation at the hands of captors. "I'll make sure Colonel Harrison understands this distinction," Cooper promised. That evening, as sunset painted the Louisiana sky in shades of orange and gold, Cooper sat alone on the steps of the administration building, watching as prisoners returned to their barracks for the night. Among them walked Lieutenant Tanaka, his back straight once more, engaged in quiet conversation with fellow officers. Already word of the new protocols had spread through the camp. Already the atmosphere had shifted subtly from the dangerous tension of the morning to something less volatile, if not exactly peaceful. Sergeant Miller emerged from the building, paused when he saw Cooper. "Colonel Harrison approved your proposal," he said, lighting a cigarette. "Implementation starts tomorrow. Japanese officers conducting initial inspections alongside our medics. Full cooperative approach." Cooper nodded, relief washing through him. "Thank you for supporting it," Miller shrugged. "Still seems like a lot of fuss over hair. But if it prevents more incidents like this morning, I'm all for it." He hesitated, then sat beside Cooper on the steps. "Something's been bothering me about all this. If surrender is so shameful in their culture, if they're taught to die rather than be captured, why do we have prisoners at all? Why didn't they all kill themselves rather than end up here?" Cooper watched Lieutenant Tanaka disappear into the barracks before answering. Human survival instinct is powerful. Even the most intense indoctrination sometimes fails in the moment of truth. Many were captured unconscious, wounded, or delirious from jungle diseases. Some genuinely believed they could escape and continue fighting. Others, perhaps they weren't ready to die, despite what they'd been taught. Miller nodded slowly, considering this. And the hair? That became their way of holding onto something after surrender? Exactly. Their final connection to honor, to identity, to who they were before captivity. The last thing they controlled in lives, completely controlled by others. As darkness fell over Camp Livingston, Cooper thought about the thousands of similar camps across America, filled with men struggling to reconcile military indoctrination with the reality of captivity. Men caught between cultures, between identities, between competing conceptions of honor and survival. In addressing one small aspect of that struggle, perhaps they had found a way forward. Not a resolution of the profound cultural differences, but an acknowledgement of them. a space where understanding might begin, where human dignity might be preserved despite the harsh realities of war. It was a small victory in a conflict that had consumed much of the world. But tonight, at least, it felt significant. Word spread through the POW network. Camp Livingston's policy adjustment traveled through official channels to other facilities housing Japanese prisoners. Some camp commanders dismissed the accommodation as unnecessary coddling. Others recognized its practical value in maintaining order. A patchwork of approaches emerged across America's vast system of POW camps, each reflecting the temperament and judgment of individual commanding officers. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Colonel William Porter read Cooper's report with skeptical eyes. His camp had already processed over 300 Japanese prisoners with mandatory haircuts. There had been resistance, yes. Incidents of self-harm, certainly. But his guards had maintained order through strict discipline. The idea of revising established protocols struck him as administratively cumbersome and potentially undermining to authority. "Request denied," he wrote in a terse memo. "Standard processing will continue." At Fort Sill in Oklahoma, Major James Reynolds saw an opportunity for intelligence gathering. If such a simple accommodation could foster goodwill, perhaps it might loosen tongues, encourage cooperation during interrogations. He implemented a modified version of Harrison's policy, allowing officers to maintain traditional hairstyles while requiring enlisted men to submit to standard cuts. The results were predictably complex. Japanese officers, grateful for the recognition of their status, became marginally more communicative. Enlisted men, watching their superiors retain this privilege while they lost their own hair, experienced yet another reinforcement of the rigid hierarchy that defined Japanese military culture, even in captivity. At Camp Shelby in Mississippi, camp administrators took a different approach entirely. After reading Cooper's cultural analysis, Captain Howard Dickinson consulted with anthropologists from nearby universities. Together, they developed a comprehensive protocol that went beyond hair, addressing dietary preferences, religious observances, and cultural ceremonies within security constraints. News of these varied approaches filtered back to Camp Livingston through official reports and informal networks. Colonel Harrison tracked the results with pragmatic interest. The accommodation of cultural differences was never about sentimentality for him, but about effective management of the human resources under his control. The reduced incidence of self-harm, the improved cooperation, the calmer atmosphere in the barracks all validated his decision from a purely practical perspective. For Cooper, however, the validation came in more personal moments. 3 weeks after the new policy took effect, he witnessed a scene that would remain etched in his memory long after the war ended. Sergeant Kenji Nakamura, the young poet who had huddled against the barracks wall during the initial haircut incident, approached Cooper after breakfast one morning. His hair had grown noticeably longer than regulation American military standards, but it remained clean, carefully maintained, according to the new hygiene protocols. "Private Cooper," he said quietly in carefully practiced English, "I wish to cut my hair." Cooper looked at him in surprise. "That's not necessary under the new policy. Your inspections have been satisfactory." Nakamura shook his head. "Not because I must, because I choose to." Something in his tone made Cooper pay closer attention. "May I ask why?" "I have written to my family," Nakamura explained, switching to Japanese. "I have told them I live. It is not what a warrior should do, but I am a poet first, perhaps. All was a disappointment to my father." He smiled slightly, the expression unfamiliar on a face that had shown little but blank resignation for weeks. "My mother will cry with joy. My father will turn his face away in shame. But they will know their son breathes still." Cooper nodded, understanding the complex emotions behind this decision. "And the haircut?" "In our tradition, when a samurai acknowledged defeat, he would cut his top knot himself. It was an act of acceptance, of responsibility. What happened before, with the Americans cutting our hair, that was different. That was humiliation. This would be my choice, my acknowledgement. The subtle but profound distinction struck Cooper forcefully. The same physical act carried entirely different meanings, depending on who performed it and why. It was a window into how deeply cultural context shaped human experience. "What can I do to help?" Cooper asked. "I wish to perform a small ceremony, nothing elaborate, a few words, a moment of reflection. And I would do this myself, not in the processing building with American barbers." Cooper arranged it with minimal difficulty. Colonel Harrison, seeing the potential symbolic value, approved the request with a simple nod. That evening, as sunset painted the sky in deepening shades of purple, Nakamura knelt in a small garden area between barracks. Several other prisoners gathered in a respectful semicircle. Lieutenant Tanaka among them. Cooper stood slightly apart, present but unobtrusive. A single guard watched from a discreet distance, more curious than concerned. Nakamura had bathed carefully beforehand, had put on his cleanest prisoner uniform. Before him lay a small cloth with simple implements, a bowl of water, a comb, a pair of scissors borrowed from the camp infirmary. First, he bowed deeply, forehead touching the ground in the direction of his distant homeland. Then he straightened, eyes closed in meditation. His lips moved in silent prayer, or perhaps poetry. Cooper couldn't hear the words, but their reverence was visible in Nakamura's expression. With deliberate movements, the young sergeant began to comb his hair, each stroke careful and precise. He dipped his hands in the water, smoothed his hair back in a traditional style. The other prisoners watched in perfect silence, many with glistening eyes. Nakamura picked up the scissors. His hands were perfectly steady now, all nervousness gone. With clear purpose, he began to cut. Black strands fell onto the white cloth he had spread beneath him. Each cut was intentional, unhurried. Not the quick, efficient removal of an American barber, but a meaningful separation, a conscious transformation. When he finished, his hair was short but even, cut with surprising neatness for someone working with basic tools and no mirror. He gathered the fallen hair carefully in the cloth, folded it with precise movements. Later, Cooper would learn that Nakamura had asked permission to burn these strands in a small ceremony, another traditional practice that Colonel Harrison had approved with pragmatic flexibility. Something had changed in Nakamura's face. The haunted look that characterized so many prisoners had given way to something quieter, more settled. Not peace exactly, but a kind of resolution. He had found a way to preserve honor within dishonor, to accept his circumstances without surrendering his identity completely. As the prisoners dispersed, Lieutenant Tanaka lingered, his expression thoughtful. "Your colonel is a wise man," he said to Cooper. "He understands something many Americans do not." "What's that, Lieutenant?" "That victory requires more than defeating an enemy's body. True victory requires understanding his soul." In the space between a prisoner and his hair lay the vast, unbridgeable gulf between two civilizations at war, not just with weapons, but with fundamentally different conceptions of what it meant to be human. The Americans valued practical efficiency, individual choice, physical survival. The Japanese valued ancestral connection, collective honor, spiritual integrity. Each side found the other's priorities nearly incomprehensible at times. Yet in small moments of accommodation, of cultural recognition, something important happened. Not understanding exactly, but acknowledgement. Recognition of difference without judgment. A space where human dignity might survive even amid the dehumanizing machinery of war. Tokyo, 1952. 7 years after surrender, American occupation forces still present, but preparing for withdrawal. The city rose from ashes, new buildings standing alongside ruins, the physical landscape mirroring the cultural transformation underway. Ancient traditions existed alongside imported democracy. Western music played in shops selling traditional crafts, and the emperor, once a living god, now stood as a constitutional monarch. Thomas Cooper, no longer private but professor at the newly established International Relations Institute, walked through Ueno Park beneath cherry blossoms in full bloom. The delicate pink petals drifted down like snow, covering the paths, settling on shoulders of passers-by. So beautiful, so temporary. The Japanese had a word for it: mono no aware, the pathos of things, the gentle sadness and the transience of beauty. He had returned to Japan not as conqueror or occupier, but as scholar, studying the cultural transformations reshaping Japanese society after defeat. His wartime experience as interpreter had profoundly influenced his academic path, directing his attention to how cultural misunderstandings shaped conflict and its aftermath. A familiar figure waited on a bench near the lotus pond. Kenji Nakamura, once sergeant, now professor of literature at Tokyo University, rose to greet him. They bowed, then shook hands in the Western style, their relationship itself a bridge between cultures. "You look well, Nakamura-san," Cooper said in Japanese. "As do you, Cooper-san," Nakamura replied in English. They settled on the bench, comfortable in the silence that followed, watching petals drift across the surface of the pond. So much had changed since their first meeting in that Louisiana camp. Nakamura's hair was now styled in the contemporary fashion, neither traditionally Japanese nor completely Western. A subtle hybrid, like so much in post-war Japan. "I visited Lieutenant Tanaka yesterday," Nakamura said after a time. "He's not well." Cooper nodded. He had heard about Tanaka's struggles since repatriation. Like many former POWs, he had returned to find himself caught between worlds. Japan had changed during his absence. The military code that had shaped his identity was now officially repudiated. Former officers who had surrendered rather than dying honorably faced subtle but persistent social ostracism. "Will he see you?" Cooper asked. "Briefly. He lives in his family's ancestral home outside Kyoto now, very traditionally, as if preserving something that might otherwise disappear entirely." Tanaka's story was not unique. Of the approximately 5,000 Japanese soldiers captured and held as POWs in America, those who returned to Japan after the war faced unique challenges. Unlike German or Italian prisoners, who generally reintegrated into their societies with minimal stigma, Japanese POWs returned to a culture that had traditionally viewed surrender as unforgivable disgrace. Many never told their families they had been captured, creating elaborate fictions about spending the war years in remote military postings. Others returned only to find themselves social outcasts, unable to find employment, rejected by family members who had performed funeral rites for them upon learning of their capture. Their government offered little support, embarrassed by their existence, preferring to celebrate the fallen rather than accommodate the returned. "And you?" Cooper asked. "How have you found the readjustment?" Nakamura smiled slightly. "I'm fortunate. The university values my American experience, my English skills, my understanding of your culture, and perhaps Japan needs poets more than warriors now." Cooper nodded. This too reflected broader patterns. Those POWs who had used their captivity to learn English, to study American customs, found themselves unexpectedly valuable in occupied Japan, serving as cultural intermediaries in business, education, and diplomacy. "I've been interviewing former camp administrators for my research," Cooper said. "Colonel Harrison retired last year. He mentioned you specifically." "The colonel with the flexible mind," Nakamura said with genuine warmth. How rare that was. He said the hair policy taught him something important about effective leadership. That understanding cultural differences wasn't sentimental, but practical. That respect created order more effectively than force. Across the pond, a group of American tourists photographed the cherry blossoms, their loud voices carrying across the water. Japanese visitors gave them polite space, some watching with curiosity, others with carefully masked irritation. "The Americans still don't understand us completely," Nakamura observed, "but perhaps they try harder now." This too reflected a larger truth. The intimate contact between Japanese prisoners and American guards had created unexpected cultural exchange. Many Americans who had entered the war, viewing Japanese as faceless, fanatical enemies, left their POW camp duties with more nuanced perspectives. Some maintained correspondence with former prisoners. Others pursued academic study of Japanese culture. A few, like Cooper, made understanding this complex society their life's work. The occupation forces themselves had benefited from lessons learned in POW camps. General MacArthur's decision to maintain the emperor as a cultural symbol rather than trying him as a war criminal reflected a growing American awareness of the profound role tradition played in Japanese society. The occupation's most successful policies acknowledged cultural realities while guiding institutional change, a balance similar to what the more adaptive POW camps had achieved on smaller scales. "I've been thinking about hair," Cooper said suddenly. Nakamura raised an eyebrow. "After all these years? It seems so trivial in retrospect, with all the destruction, the deaths, the cities reduced to ash. How could something so small matter so much?" "But that is precisely why it mattered," Nakamura replied. "When everything else is destroyed, the small things become enormous. When you have nothing, anything you can still call your own becomes everything." Cooper nodded, remembering Lieutenant Tanaka's face as his hair fell to the floor, the profound grief in his eyes. At the time, it had seemed almost incomprehensible. Now, with years of study and reflection, he understood it as a universal human response to loss of identity, only intensified by specific cultural context. "I spoke with Captain Yoshida's widow last month," Nakamura said quietly. Cooper felt a pang of sadness. The captain had never recovered from his experiences. After repatriation, he had lived as a virtual recluse, plagued by what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress. 3 years ago, he had taken his own life in a traditional manner, finally completing what he had attempted in that processing room so many years before. "She showed me something remarkable," Nakamura continued. "A letter he wrote, but never sent to an American guard who had shown him kindness. In it, he tried to explain why the haircuts had affected the prisoners so deeply. His words were poetic. He wrote that for a Japanese soldier, hair was not just hair, but history itself, growing from the same roots as one's ancestors, nourished by the same blood." Cherry blossoms continued to fall around them, pink against a blue sky, beautiful in their impermanence. Cooper remembered the white cloth Nakamura had spread beneath him during his voluntary haircut ceremony, the careful collection of fallen strands, the ritualized acknowledgement of transformation. The story of Japanese prisoners and their hair reminds us that, in war's darkest moments, humanity reveals itself, not in grand strategies or territorial conquests, but in the quiet, desperate struggle to hold on to who we are, even if only by a few strands, Cooper said softly. Nakamura nodded. "And when we lose even that, we must find new ways to rebuild ourselves." They sat in companionable silence, professor and poet, former guard and prisoner, now colleagues, perhaps friends. Around them, Japan continued its own complex rebuilding, integrating foreign influences while maintaining cultural essence, finding new paths forward without completely abandoning ancient ways. In the distance, a tour guide led American visitors through the park, explaining the significance of cherry blossoms in Japanese culture, translating poetry carved into stone monuments. Small efforts to bridge vast differences in perception, to make the foreign at least partially understandable. "I must return to the university," Nakamura said eventually, rising from the bench. "My students await." "Of course." "But before you go," Cooper hesitated, then asked the question that had brought him back to Japan, that drove his academic work, that had haunted him since those days in Louisiana. "Do you think genuine understanding between different cultures is truly possible? Or are there gulfs too wide to bridge?" Nakamura considered the question with scholarly seriousness. "Complete understanding? No. But perhaps that isn't necessary. Perhaps recognition of difference, respect for what we cannot fully comprehend, is enough to prevent the worst kinds of conflict." He gestured toward the American tourists, now bowing awkwardly to an elderly Japanese woman who had offered to take their photograph. "They try. They fail. They try again. This is the path forward." As they parted ways, Cooper thought about current conflicts simmering across the globe, new cultural misunderstandings, creating friction between peoples who viewed the world through fundamentally different lenses. Korea, Indochina, the Middle East. Each region contained similar potential for catastrophic failure of cross-cultural communication. And we might ask ourselves, he thought, watching Nakamura disappear among cherry trees, what do we fail to see today in those we consider our enemies? What sacred things do we casually cut away? The question had no easy answer, but perhaps asking it was a beginning.